There are 1,000,000 ways to die. We just wanna talk about it. Codeheads.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Codeheads.
Welcome
Did we
back.
welcome back, Otter. And we are hoping that you guys are having a fabulous week. And we hope that you enjoyed our last pod on the history of CPR. And we enjoy that you nerded out with us on that. And we're going to kind of deep dive a little bit into some of the topics that we breezed over. We told you that there was a lot more, and we kind of skipped century to century just for fun. And one of the big things that we skipped over that we wanted to talk about today is we're going to get snatched. We wanted to talk about body snatching and the history of it and how it kind of goes into medicine and resuscitation, which is pretty cool.
And
So,
social quality,
yes, that's
right?
true.
I'll get into that, but
That
there's a lot. It's a ripe topic. It's not just the grotesque side of it, right? We're going to talk about its impact, societal impact, and
Yep,
for advancement. So carry on.
that's true. I just like the grotesque side, but there are, but there are obviously softer sides as well. Thank God we have Mike for that. So we're going to talk about that, and I think one of the most fascinating things for me is that I think in modern times we talk about it as body snatching, and when we hear about it, and which I guess is kind of a crude way to refer to these gentlemen, for lack of a better term, and what they did, they called themselves resurrectionists.
Yeah.
So they were the ones that were either robbing graves or somehow finding these bodies. So it is kind of a grimmer chapter, I would say, in medical history. But it is really deeply tied into the boom of medical education and how we learned about anatomy and how bodies work. And it really helped us to learn more about how bodies work.
So you
And it's
increase in demand because of the boom in medical pursuits. So you have that demand, but the supply is lacking. And
correct.
so our resurrectionists, which is darkly poetic, they became available. They found a niche in the market and they took it.
They did. They were smart businessmen, I guess. So they saw that. And it was really like the mid 18th century. It was like the 18th and 19th centuries where this really happened. And it started primarily in the UK. And two of the bigger areas were in Edinburgh, Scotland, and then in London, England, because they had the two biggest medical schools, or they had the two medical schools that were kind of like, really starting to get into doing a lot of formalized education. But as Mike said, there just weren't cadavers to learn off of. And there were legal implications to just kind of using bodies. So in 1752, there was actually something called the Murder Act. And it actually increased the legal supply of bodies by allowing any sort of executed murderer to be dissected instead of buried. So anybody who was nefarious, especially who had murdered someone else and they were executed, under rule of law at that time, they were able to be used for medical studies. And so those bodies weren't necessarily resurrected. But there also weren't that many murderers. There were, but not enough to meet the needs of the medical education and the needs. So it was only like a few bodies a year. And so that drew to this explosion of needing bodies. So they started kind of looking for corpses of, other criminals that were executed, any sort of suicides, any babies or orphans. And those were technically legal bodies in Scotland in the late 18th century. But again, still not enough to meet all of the needs of like the surgeons and the medical doctors and everyone who was kind of, needing this education. And so and this sounds wild. Obviously, this would not be the cost now, but back then it was only 5 to 10 pounds per body. So that's like,
Yes.
10, $20 a body, in US dollars. But yeah, so that's why the resurrectionists kind of came around. So they would exhume these bodies, and then they would sell them backdoor to, anatomists. Um, but they also started grave robbing because it wasn't considered theft.
Could I talk about that for one moment?
Yes.
So they were disturbingly good at what they did. And one thing I found really fascinating is, they target the fresh graves typically within a day or two for obvious reasons, but they didn't dig up the whole grave. They dig only at the head end of the coffin, break open the lid just enough to get the body out and drag it up. Now, why would they do that? They were leaving the clothes behind because stealing a body technically wasn't theft under law. The bodies weren't considered property, but the
Oh,
clothes were. So if they took the clothes, that was actual robbery and they could be prosecuted.
wow. I actually did not know that.
Yes.
You did a deep dive. You outdove me. That's wild.
Right?
And you're right. That's smart.
It's very smart. They weren't stupid.
I'm telling you, yet again, bad guys are like really smart, and I wish bad guys used their like smarts for good, be a different world. But that is very smart. Hmm. So he's pulled him right out with no clothes.
Or
Well, I
they
guess
sort of maybe push the clothes off because, that'd be such a faux pas, if they
right.
took the clothes too.
Well,
So,
they need to be nudie anyways.
right.
That
So,
is is wild. And, and that's when actually they started having, because of the grave robbings, right? That's when they started having, um, you know, people watching at
yep.
graveyards. That's
Yep.
when that all started. Because previous to a grave robbing, graveyards were just kind of left alone. They were sacred
Right.
places. But then they started having caretakers, 24/7 caretakers of graveyards, and that became because of, this flourishing trade in the late 1700s.
They also so they were protecting the graves of loved ones and they put these iron cages over some of them and they were called mort
Yeah.
safes, MORT. For our francophone friends, that means death. So they were putting I mean, think about this. You're
Big
on
dead
watch.
houses.
You're on watch to protect your loved one from being exhumed after just suffering a terrible traumatic event, they just died and now you have to worry about someone coming to grab them. And there was religious considerations, like the body was buried, and to take it out, that might preclude their entry into another dimension in the afterlife. So they were just really protecting all aspects of it. And it's just the last thing you want to do when you're grieving is have to protect that, like this, with
Right.
your cages, your fists, what have you.
Well, and that's what's interesting too, because then, these resurrectionists, as they were, worked in gangs. So there were like, a bunch of them that worked together. And which is probably the best way to do it, if they had to do it. But that's why they tended to go to more like rural graveyards, or, where people of lesser means were buried, because wealthier people could obviously afford these, the mort safes, and they could, whatever they were called.
Yeah.
And those graveyards with wealthier people, they had the private pay watch houses, so the caretakers that were there.
Yes.
But in with people with lesser means, that wasn't really an option. So those tended to be the bodies that either the family was standing guard by themselves for a few days, or, those were the bodies that were snatched. Um, which is, I mean, I guess apropos for, you know, society and people of lesser means, is that they they get screwed once again.
Yep.
But I guess it started early on. But also that would impact, the bodies that they are that they're learning off of. Right. They're learning off of people who might eat different foods, might have, different backgrounds.
Mhm.
They weren't learning off of all bodies as we can now, because anybody can
True.
donate their body to medical science when they pass. So it's really it's very interesting, that kind of bias and flaw that happened very early on, just for the need of studying and learning about bodies. That their early education was kind of biased, with criminals and ne'er-do-wells and or people of lesser means. Um, and the biggest areas that it happened was really in, I think I mentioned Edinburgh and London, and then there's a place called Newcastle upon Tyne, and Aberdeen, and those were the biggest places in the UK that really had this you know body snatching occurring, or those were the points where they kind of like passed off bodies. Um, and there were a couple of resurrectionists that were probably the most notable or well known, because they've had books written about them and whatnot. And it's probably why my head always goes back to Edinburgh. I lived there for a while, and I love it there. But also, this dark history of William Burke and William Hare.
Yeah.
In I think they were 1827 to like 1828 was their heyday
Yeah.
of their non-traditional grave robbing, as it were. So they actually just went and straight up murdered people. They murdered, I believe, like around 16 people. They would just lure them into Hare's house, and then they suffocated them, and then they sold these fresh, like hot off the press corpses, to an anatomist named Robert Knox, so he could do these live dissection, or not live dissections, 'cause no one's living, but the people there, he would do these fresh dissections, and he had the freshest bodies. So he was like selling out these lectures. Everyone, and no one really knew the secret of where he was getting these like fresh corpses to study. Um, so it's really wild. And the only reason, honestly, they were caught is because of one murder too far. I guess that's how it always goes. But this woman named Mary Doherty was murdered, and that was the one that just kind of boom. It set them aflame, because Mary actually went missing. She wasn't a ne'er do well that they were just luring. Someone knew where she was going, and they figured out that that's where she went, and that's how she was killed. So and actually, Burke was hanged publicly in 1829, and his body is still in. He was publicly dissected, and his skeleton
Oh,
is actually still in the Edinburgh Medical College. Remember when I told you to go look at that
I did
museum?
go. I didn't see that.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah. That's
isn't that?
cool.
It is kind of cool.
So he got what he deserved. He got
Yeah,
that
and he got dissected himself, and he's still there.
on display.
Yeah, which is a very cool history of medicine museum
Mhm.
in Edinburgh. It's if you go there, do it. And then there were some copycats. There was some guy in London, the London Burkers, John Bishop and Thomas Williams, and they also were starting to like murder people and sell the bodies. But after that point, uh, they started to make some more laws, and people were more aware of that practice. So people started to kind of, not be lured so easily. And I think when different anatomists and schools were sold like a still warm body, it just kind of became a little bit more, despite the fact that it was probably more helpful when they were learning about bodies. They
Yeah.
started to question it, and it became kind of like maybe this isn't the right thing to do.
And I think that is why this story still fascinates us. Like, body snatching sits at this like creepy intersection of science and ethics. And it's also about class inequality, the fear of death, what happens to our bodies after we die. Like I was mentioning, when they are taken out of the ground, like, does that disturb that process? And it's, again, we touched on this. It's a reminder that medical progress has not just been built on the shoulders of giants, but the poor and the vulnerable. So
Correct.
it's unwilling sacrifice that they have made toward our betterment.
Right, which is really, it's interesting, and it's unfortunate that it has happened that way.
Yep.
Um, but there's so many reasons why it has happened that way, but it's unfortunate because, as I said, when we look through the history, we see that, anybody who is, of a lesser socioeconomic status is, taken advantage of in many different ways, um, and set up for failure in life. But in this, they're also set up for failure in death too. Just because they are, of different means doesn't mean that they have any sort of different, religious beliefs, or, whatever their family is into. And so it seems unfortunate that even in death, they were utilized. But, and to this day, medicine, you know, we're going to talk about different things in history, Tuskegee trials and other things, where those who are disadvantaged or who have been in different statuses have been taken advantage of. And
And
that's where,
fortunately, at least in the US, like now, well, elsewhere, but we have advanced directives, and that started in 1968 in the US. There was an act called, what was it called? Uniform Anatomical Gift Act. And that created a legal framework to donate bodies and organs after death. So it became a little more humane, a little more organized, that process.
but what a lot, I mean, that was not until the 1960s. Like, what a,
Right. Not
wowza.
long ago. Not long ago did we clean up our act.
I know, holy moly. Um, but it's interesting how many of those early anatomists and early surgeons like really used these bodies to get us to where we are now.
Right.
They looked at how lungs inflated, how, how veins and arteries tended to work. They were able to find out like all the valves in the heart, like all these things that they had kind of just been kind of guesstimating, for a lack of better term, for many, many years, or using animals or otherwise to kind of make their assertions about medicine and how bodies worked. And I think that's why they would just be like, oh, drink this weird potion. Um,
The ends justified the means. That's how it was viewed.
it was, yeah, it was. But it is
Easy to
interesting.
say if it's not your body or a loved one's body.
Right, I know. Yeah, easier
Usually
said than
says,
done.
well, we got something good out of this, right?
Yeah, and and I think nowadays, I will just say the cost of a burial is unbelievable when people do pass. So, I think that now sometimes people are looking at donating their bodies to medicine, as a really charitable thing to do to like help out these medical schools, but also it saves them a lot of costs as well. So I
True.
think that if people, don't have any deep-seated beliefs, you know, that's what I plan on doing actually when I pass is
Same,
is that my
same,
body
no
is
doubt.
donated.
No doubt. No doubt.
Then they'll really find all the wacky stuff going on in this body.
I mean, am I truly worth a permanent monument? I don't think
Yes.
so. I'd
I think we both are. I mean,
contribute to someone else. I could give them parts of me that'll enable them to live longer, have a better life, education. What do I care?
right. My vessel is gone at that point. So I think just to round things out here, whilst this practice really, advanced science in many, many leaps and bounds, it is one of the darkest parts of medical history. Whilst, as Mike said, one of the most booming areas of medical progress. And it did come at a pretty profound human cost. But it's also really fascinating to see where we've gone from there to now all of the rigor we have in like IRBs today to do any testing and to do any studying. And now we have free will and ability to donate our bodies to the betterment of medicine. So it's something to think about. And sorry, it's a bit of a macabre kind of topic, but it's a really cool part of medical history. So, and the foundation of resuscitation.
True.
So we hope you guys enjoyed, and we'll see you back next week on Codeheads. Eek, if I can get the music.
There are 1,000,000 ways to die. We just wanna talk